there's been a lot on this in the last few days, and I certainly don't need to or want to reiterate the President's view on why avoiding Brexit is important to the United States. Peace, prosperity, democracy, America's historic mission in Europe, blah, 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 blah. I think you've got the basic gist over the last few days of why the U.S. government thinks that Britain should remain within the EU. And I think all of these are very important issues, and I agree, but they have been, I think, very well covered by someone who is much more eloquent and authoritative on the subject than I am. So I think what I'd really rather spend my time doing is just getting a little bit at John's questions and a bit of a follow-up rather on some of the issues that the President's intervention raised in the Brexit debate in the United Kingdom. First, I think that there have been a lot of comments in the follow-up about a special animus that President Obama has for the United Kingdom, or that he is a lame duck president, and so his views are in some sense not representative, that his views are somehow personal or partisan, and the next president may well feel differently, and so he is not in some sense speaking authoritatively on this subject. I think it's important to understand, for British voters who are trying or interested in the American view, that Obama really does represent a very strong cross-party consensus in the United States on this question. It goes back decades. It's a strong bipartisan consensus across both of the Republican and Democratic parties, at least in their foreign policy elites. I mean, I have to admit, who the hell knows what Trump thinks on this or any other subject, but I think for any other candidate that we've seen in the last several decades, this has been a core of American policy. I mean, I was sort of reminded of this when I got a call just before the President's visit from the BBC, and they said, will you go on TV to oppose Brexit? And I said, because we're looking for Americans to debate the question in the run-up to the President's visit. And I said, no, I mean, will you go on television to favor Brexit? And I said, no, I'm opposed to it. And they said, well, do you know anybody? We're having a lot of trouble finding Americans who will take that position on television or anywhere else. And this, this sort of gets to the sort of BBC's concept of balance, which is if it's 98% to 2, you still have to represent them evenly in a debate. And I think that that's actually the situation in the United States, at least among people who ever think about this question, that they're simply, it's pretty hard to find people. I noticed that the BBC did, but it's a big country, and the 2% do represent something. You can always find someone in the United States. Keep that in mind if you're organizing a panel. But this is a strong consensus, and I can say very clearly that the United States policy on this is not going to change. That it's not a question of this sort of being getting that once Britain leaves, everything will be forgotten. And it's really not hard to understand why. I think this is not a difficult question to comprehend even from outside the United States. For the United States, the special relationship has always been a very practical one. It has served the United States well, but it has frankly never been about emotion, as it often seems to be on this side of the Atlantic. All of this sort of Churchillian talk about Anglospheres, that stuff didn't even interest Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he was hearing it from Churchill. And it doesn't really interest us very much right now, and it hasn't held appeal for U.S. presidents ever since Roosevelt, despite the kind words that they tend to say at press conferences. For the United States, this is an ever more challenging world, a world in which U.S. and Western power is relatively declining, and a world in which the United States needs to pay attention to other areas of the world, in which it hopes that Europe, which is, for all the problems that Europeans rightly like to discuss, on their continent in the neighborhood is actually, from a U.S. foreign policy perspective, the most settled area of concern, and the area of concern in which it has a partner which it could hope could take care of security and could relieve it of burdens for other areas that it expects to be more problematic in the future, particularly East Asia and the Middle East. So there is no special deal for the United Kingdom with the United States. Arguably, there has never been. And, you know, getting to the back of the queue, I think, is a harsh way to put this, and I think maybe the President regrets it, but I think it certainly does express the consensus view. It's important to understand when it comes to trade deals, to get at some of John's question, that the United States government has not been able to simultaneously handle the Pacific trade deal and the Atlantic trade deal. They had to put them sequentially, and that was just a case of both the weight that the political traffic and the bureaucratic capacity of the U.S. government would bear. And so that is a sort of reality of policymaking, and I think that's what the President was expressing. So the second question I think that comes from the President's intervention is the one that John also raised about British domestic politics. Is it appropriate to intervene? Should you listen to America? Does U.S. intervention put off UK voters? I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't know if it was wise. I don't know anything about UK voters. I don't really know that much about U.S. voters, to be honest with you, watching the election. But what I think I can say is that Brexit is obviously, and the President said this too, a British sovereign decision, and no one questions that. And no one is calling into question the idea that this is a decision that Britain has the right to make and that it should make itself. But the United States has been instrumentalized in this debate. The Leave campaign was saying that there was a United States special option in both trade and security. When I was in the US government, we had a rule. If someone claimed something about you in front of you and it was false, you had to stand up and say it wasn't, because if you didn't stand up, you were implicitly acknowledging it. It's quite clear that the U.S. has stakes in this debate and that it cares. And it would have been irresponsible, I think, as the U.S. government not to speak up. I have to say also there's a sort of weirdness about this idea that one hears all the time, that U.S. intervention will turn off voters. The whole idea that someone would decide something as important as their country's future in the European Union based on pique about a foreign intervention in the debate seems a little bit odd to me. It is, I think, a definition maybe of geopolitical maturity, to slightly paraphrase that great geopolitical strategist Woody Allen, that geopolitical maturity is when you do what you want to do, even though the United States wants you to do it. And I think that is at least a level of maturity that I would at least I would hope to ascribe to the British voter.
If I want to be really short, I can say the view from Canada is pretty much zero on what's happening here. If there's an interest in the debate, it's mainly an elite concern, those who deal with European issues, those who are concerned about it. But the Canadian government itself is refusing to be drawn. It probably has views, but certainly not expressing them firmly. Our Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, was here in London a couple of weeks ago, and he very firmly said he wasn't going to comment on it. Chrystia Freeland, who's the Minister of International Trade and Commerce, said a few days ago, it's very important for us as a government not to speculate about hypothetical decisions that other countries might take in the future. And Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, has only indirectly referred to the referendum. He said Canada has a direct stake in a strong and united European Union. Canadian foreign policy interests, I think, are, as far as Europe is concerned, in trying to complete the Comprehensive and Economic Trade Agreement, which is held up on a couple of issues, including investment protection. It has a strategic partnership agreement with the European Union, bilateral cooperation on things like security, terrorism, drugs, human rights, which still needs, I think, really to be fleshed out. And There's been very little interest in the Canadian press or among the Canadian public in the referendum. Now that may change, but so far the only things I've been able to find that are happening in Canada is David Owen is speaking twice on why Britain should leave the European Union, once in Ottawa and once in Toronto, and Conrad Black has written an article in favour of Brexit. That seems to me about the height of Canadian public concern at this stage. Our main foreign policy interests are, apart from the EU, which is not, I think, a major one, I think our main foreign policy interest is in repairing our relationship with the United States. The United States, since the Second World War, and probably even before, was a major concern for very obvious reasons for any Canadian government of any political stripe. We have to get on well with the United States. Curiously, the last government before this one, the Conservative government, did not manage relationships well, and I think there was a fundamental lack of sympathy between the Obama administration and the Stephen Harper government, and it was shown in the Keystone Pipeline issue, for example, where relations became very, very difficult indeed. And there is a story which I'm inclined to believe is true, that President Obama phoned Stephen Harper, our Prime Minister, and said, "We're going to do a deal with Iran, and we really hope we'll get your support on this." And Harper said, "No, absolutely not." He took a very strong line in Iran, and Obama apparently lost his temper and said, "Well, you can forget about the Keystone Pipeline," and slammed down the phone. And I think quite rightly this government is going to spend a lot of time trying to mend relations with the United States because it's the key relationship for our country. We're also increasingly focused on Asia-Pacific. We're part of the Trans-Pacific Agreement. We've been part of the negotiations. We are spending a lot of time managing our relationship with countries such as Taiwan, with Korea, with Japan, and of course with China. And we also have a strong interest in Latin America, particularly in the Caribbean and Mexico. I think there's also probably, given Canada's own nature and history, I would suspect a fundamental lack of sympathy with those who would want to get out of the European Union. We are a federal country. We've managed to remain a federal country. We understand federalism. It works in our country. And so we don't, I think, really understand what the British concerns are. We've given away sovereignty within the country. Provinces have given away sovereignty. And we've also been part of larger groupings ever since we became a nation. We were part of the British Empire when we became a nation in 1867. And as we gradually moved to autonomy within the British Empire, we became part of other large groupings. We understand that our interests are in being linked to other larger groupings in what is often a very uncertain world. We are a multilateral power, I think, and a federal power simply because of history. We are part of the North American Free Trade Agreement with the United States, and we have never, there have been specific issues which we found difficult with the United States, but then there always are specific issues. But I think, on the whole, the Canadian public has accepted that we should be part of larger free trade organizations and arrangements. We are a multicultural nation, and so we don't share the concern in Britain about immigration. Canadians are very open to immigration. Probably half the people living in Canada were born elsewhere. My own city, Toronto, it's well over, it's well over half. And this is something that is not so much a matter of concern, but in fact rather a matter of pride. And so the concerns which in Britain, and I think a lot of the debate about the EU, whether Britain should remain in or out, have got very much mixed up with immigration. And I think that in Canada is something we simply don't understand. Because for us, immigration is a positive good, and we regard it as something that has made Canadian society both a stronger and I think a more interesting place. And so I don't think, on the whole, if I have to predict, if Canadians were polled on what they think about whether Britain should stay in or out, I think most Canadians would either say it's a matter for the British themselves, or if they were pushed, I think they'd say that the British should remain in. It simply is something that Canadians would feel much more comfortable with. As for the idea, which is being floated by some of those in favour of Brexit, that if Britain left the European Union, it would immediately resume its place in the Anglosphere, possibly as leader of the Anglosphere, that Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and Americans are waiting for Britain to come out of its membership of the European Union. I really don't think this is something, my own view is something that's likely to happen. Just give you a few statistics. Trade figures for 2014 Total trade with the United States for Canada, that's both imports and exports, was something like $750 million Canadian, $1 billion Canadian. The next closest, 750 million, sorry, the next closest was the EU, 89 million Canadian, UK 24 million of that. And so I don't think that, as far as Canadians are concerned, at least in economic terms, that we see ourselves as being increasingly tightly linked to Britain. I think the other thing that's very important, which has affected Canadian attitudes, is the changing patterns of immigration. When I was growing up in Canada, it still was a very European and indeed a very British sort of society, particularly among English speakers, of course, much less so among French speakers. I mean, pre-1967, when Trudeau made reforms and threw immigration open, something like 80% of all Canadian immigrants came from Europe. And that meant that there were close cultural ties and there were also close family ties. When I grew up in Canada, a lot of us had family in the UK, a lot of people had been educated in the United Kingdom. It was something that there were a lot of links, both cultural and familial and others. That's gone. I mean, that went after 1967, and the largest source of immigrants in the past 5 years to Canada has been Asia and the Middle East, followed closely by Africa, the Caribbean, Central and South America. Europe is now under 30% of the immigrants coming to Canada. And so I think in Canada, the old links really have gone. As far as a Canadian intervention in the debate, we're unlikely to intervene. We're unlikely to be noticed if we intervene. Where we will be a part of the debate is we will be used as some sort of mythical country. We're already being used by people like Boris Johnson. The Canadian model is being talked about, and what strikes me as a Canadian, it's usually talked about by people who don't know the first thing about Canada. Thank you.
I think it's true to say that China always has, and certainly at the moment, a distrust of multinational organizations. Unlike Canada, China likes dealing bilaterally with governments, and that might seem an argument that actually what would it like better than to deal with a Britain standing on its own outside the EU. But I think exactly the opposite is true. From conversations with Chinese officials over the last few years, the picture that I get is that in fact they wish the EU was much more like them in being a much more unitary organisation which they could deal with on a bilateral basis. The EU confounds them because China by and large doesn't get the kind of arguments, horse trading, public disputes which you see within the EU, the different priorities and so on. At the time of the Scottish referendum, a main government think tank in China sent a delegation over here to see the Scottish referendum, but also to report more generally on Europe. And at a dinner, the leader of the delegation asked me, we just don't understand, what is this union which is so disunited? Because in Chinese terms, the kind of discussion which we're very used to in the EU is a very negative process there. I mean, in China, remember, always, ever since the first emperor, 2,500 years ago, dissent equates to treason. There is no tradition of discussion and, if you like, reasoned compromise. Nearly all the major transitions and moves in Chinese history over the last 2,500 years have been achieved by violence. So the Brussels, if you like, talking on and stopping the clock at midnight and all the other things, just doesn't, naturally, the Chinese do not relate to that. Their hope some time ago, let's say at the end of the last century and with the coming of the euro, was that Europe would act as a counterweight to the United States and the euro as a counterweight to the dollar, which they would still like to happen, but I think they've given up hope of that very largely. So there's an obvious contradiction in this, but that's not unusual in policy, Chinese foreign policies. At the same time, they would like to be dealing with a stronger EU as an outfit, but at the same time, China is very adept at cherry picking among European governments. It does the big trade negotiations with the commissioner in Brussels, but then it's conducting a whole network of bilateral negotiations at the same time. And it has become also very adept at playing off, if you like, the political, the commercial and the fear factor in it, which we saw notably in this country when you hear the terrible phrase from the Chinese ambassador, you have harmed the feelings of 1.3 billion Chinese. You know that you're in trouble there. But that is used, as it was on David Cameron after he took tea with the Dalai Lama, to frighten governments. You find, in fact, during that period when Cameron and Britain were on the naughty step with Beijing, trade actually increased. So the two don't necessarily always go together, but everybody in Europe, except Angela Merkel, seems to be terrified of getting on the wrong side of the Chinese. And there's very good reason why Merkel, on her last visit to Beijing, for instance, had a quite open hour-long meeting with dissidents and human rights lawyers that was announced by the German embassy at the point when Cameron was saying, don't mention Tibet or the Dalai Lama or human rights or anything else, when she was here last October. Merkel can do that because China still needs a lot of German exports and German expertise, particularly in the sectors where it wants to go ahead. So I think that the Chinese view of Britain, despite all the propaganda over the coming golden era of Sino-British relations, which we had at the end of last year and still have to some extent, the Chinese view the EU very much view the UK very much in the EU context. Some elements, obviously, of Chinese investment in this country are not particularly affected by Remain or Leave. I imagine the investments in real estate and in luxury homes in Mayfair and Kensington would continue whether we were in or out. On the other hand, the position of the City of London is quite important for China because of the way that the city has built itself up as a hub for renminbi dealing, the biggest in Europe, and access to the Eurozone is a very important part of that in China, for China. And if that was affected, it would definitely be quite a negative. At the same time, it's interesting that the nuclear deal, whatever you think of it, and I have great doubts about it, when you speak to Chinese officials, they see it very much as they will build or finance nuclear power stations in Britain, but this is an Anglo-French-Chinese deal. Okay, the French technology doesn't work, which is a slight problem, but it's seen, again, in this European context. Again, Chinese motor car manufacturers who would like to probably buy up some more plant here see that very much in terms of being able to serve the European market more widely. So it's rather like the Japanese investment of 20, 30 years ago, which was very much Britain as a door into the rest of the EU. And if Brexit were to win, if Britain were to lose, I think China would see this country as a small player, which it doesn't actually have to deal with all that much, which it will push any difficulties Britain may have after Brexit for its own advantage, using its financial muscle for that. So I suppose you could say if Brexit went wrong and things started to turn seriously negative, perhaps President Xi would come back with his checkbook and use the 4 trillion in reserves to buy up as much of Britain as possible, which I suppose you could say might be a kind of Hong Kong in reverse.